Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to everyone joining us. I'm thrilled to welcome you to this panel discussion titled Who Sets the Climate Agenda at American University's first Seeing Climate Change Symposium. The link for the website with additional information about the rest of the events will be in the chat. I'm Megan Litke, the Director of Sustainability here at American University in Washington, D.C. Today, I'm joined by three panelists who will share their perspectives on this topic. First, I'd like to welcome them. Devi Lockwood has written about science, climate change, and technology for the New York Times, The Guardian, Slate, and The Washington Post, among others. She spent 5 years traveling in 20 countries on 6 continents to document 1,001 stories on water and climate change, funded in part by the Gardner and Shaw Postgraduate Traveling Fellowships from Harvard and a National Geographic Early Career Grant. Her first book, 1001 Voices on Climate Change, was published by Simon & Schuster in August. Next, Olufemi Taiwo is assistant professor at Georgetown University, where he teaches and writes about social and political philosophy. His work has been featured in The New Yorker, Dissent, The Nation, and other outlets. His forthcoming book, Reconsidering Reparations, is scheduled for release in December and considers links between reparations for racial justice and climate justice. Finally, Andy Revkin has covered climate change in magazines, books, and for the New York Times since 1988, and is now building an initiative on communication and sustainability at Columbia University's new climate school. Along with his news stories for the Times, he built an award-winning blog, .earth, and he has resumed that interactive form of journalism in a new Sustain What column at revkin.bulletin.com, and a video webcast series by the same name through Columbia. In spare moments, he's a performing songwriter and co-leader of a Hudson Valley ensemble called Breakneck Ridge Review. Welcome to everyone. And thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome to be here.
Thank you.
I'd like to begin the discussion with a question that I'd like to hear from each of you on. Who do you see creating the climate agenda today? And how has that changed from your vantage point in, say, the last 10 or 15 years? Devi, would you like to lead us off?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I have a bit of a unique perspective on this because I was traveling in 20 countries on 6 continents with a cardboard sign around my neck that said, "Tell me a story about climate change" on one side and "Tell me a story about water" on the other. And I started doing this in 2014. And I would say that at that time, people were a lot more hesitant to talk about climate change than I think they are today. And I think that part of that change has to do with just more intense events being experienced by more people. It's becoming harder to not know someone who's already been impacted by climate change in some way. And also just frankly, a really incredible generation of youth activists who are in the generation behind me coming up and just demanding that climate change be something that we talk about internationally in an everyday way. And so I see kind of those two things working in tandem as forcing these issues forward in a more dynamic way, and that people are, for the most part, when they have an opportunity to speak about climate change, a lot less hesitant to draw these connections together than they were even, 5-10 years ago.
Thank you. Femi, would you like to share your perspective?
Yeah, sure. So broadly, I would say that 10, 15 years ago, I think the conversation was dominated by one cast of kind of global north, well-resourced institutional characters. For the most part, the fossil fuel, the extractive companies themselves and politicians they've bought, and to a lesser extent, the kind of well-resourced environmental left organizations of the global north. And I think that one thing that has changed over the past 10 to 15 years is a growing awareness from youth activists, like Devi said. But I would say that the conversation has kind of expanded to a larger ensemble of all the aforementioned groups of people, as far as what's circulating globally. So we haven't quite yet gotten to the point where there's anything like equality and prominence of different groups of people, but there are other organizations. The Petroleum Workers Union of Brazil and South African Federation of Trade Unions have recently taken some fairly public climate justice positions. So it's certainly not a monopoly by any of the global North folks, but that's how I see things globally.
Yeah, I mean, that point about, I guess one thing I'd say right away is that there's no single agenda and there's no single context. In Washington, I think in America, generally the issue was initially framed as a science problem. My first article on global warming in 1988, and it was in a science magazine, and it was all CO2 and sea ice and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the UN treaty sort of dominated the early story. In the 2000s, this started to generate national projects. The first climate bills were Lieberman and McCain. And once it got into that arena, then the agendas quickly became fossil fans had their agenda, and environmental groups, as Olus said, had their agenda, which was really regulatory. Let's see if we can tamp this down with the Clean Air Act. And what is new now, I think, is the broadened social contexts, both internationally and here in America, and that's what you've seen around the infrastructure bill and the new bill, the other bill that still being contested. It's social progressives who are saying the climate impacts, which of course are weighted on communities who have been marginalized or prejudiced against for decades, if not generations. Those contexts have come into the foreground. So that's the story. It used to be a science story. Then it was like a conventional regulatory story. And by the way, that we're not going to regulate away carbon dioxide. This is not going to happen. And then on the right, on the side of the conservatives, absolutely, the fossil fuel industry has been incredibly effective at sustaining that end of the conversation. Just a week ago, just briefly, I wrote a piece about the hearing in the House on the big oil and disinformation. And if you watched the hearing as a progressive, you were going, "Yay, this is great! They're getting their tobacco moment." If you watch the hearing through the channels of social media on the right, it was like, "Yay, we're punishing them because gas prices are rising and they're trying to make global warming a problem," when they're saying that oil companies should stop taking oil out of the ground when people are paying $3.50 a gallon. So it's like there's not one agenda. And that's what makes this, I won't say terrifying, but exasperating.
Thank you. So given the changes that you've seen that you all mentioned and the multiple agendas that are on the table, when you think into the future in 5, 10, 15 years, what would you like to see then as I should say, like, who would you like to see setting the climate agenda at that time? And what changes would we need to see now to get there in 5, 10, further out into the future years?
I mean, I think the COP conference is happening right now, and I was there 5 years ago in 2016 at the conference in Morocco. And I think a longstanding complaint of folks who are there in a civil society capacity is that their participation can feel really circumscribed and tokenized, or that, youth who have traveled from Pacific Island nations to give a talk are, speaking sometimes to an empty room. And there's a way in which, because climate change is a right now problem, but a getting worse in the future problem, that youth voices even more so need to be empowered. And I think that there's a lot of forces working against that happening. So I think that those, not only voices of people who are younger, but voices of people who are the most impacted. I think that it's really easy to overlook people who are in the global south, or like Andy mentioned, are already experiencing multiple forms of marginalization, and climate change is just intensifying and making this worse, right? But to the extent that we can amplify, listen to, seek out, and kind of promote the voices of people who are experiencing these changes now, I think that that will direct us towards the path of better solutions, because solutions that don't take those voices into account are dangerous.
I couldn't agree more. The one thing I didn't want to jump the queue if we're going, but the best thing I think that we could see 10 or 15 years from now is less of a focus on these annual COP circuses and more of a focus on what you can do on the ground domestically and in a distributed way. One of the things I'm working really hard on at Columbia at the New Climate School and through my webcast is to literally spread the capacity for communities to share and shape their own understanding and their own responses to climate risk, particularly whether it's flash floods, whether it's wildfire in the West. This idea that's going to be some magical top-down solution is fantastical, and that's resources can come like through these bills. But if you don't have the capacity in a community to develop the sensory apparatus, so that if you're living in a city facing an extreme heat wave, someone knows where the old people are who are living without air conditioning, and that can do an enormous amount to buffer us against the impacts of climate extremes, even as this big, long challenge of decarbonizing our energy system plays out. Christy Ebi, actually, she says in Seattle, she's one of the top climate and health experts in the world. She told me not long ago, nobody needs to die in a heat wave, period. And she's right. And that's like, 50 years from now, there may be heat waves that are uninhabitable for everybody if you're not in an air-conditioned subterranean complex or something. But between now and then, it's social cohesion, social action, societies getting engaged with their elected officials to say, hey, we have a network here. We want to know better who's in a basement, who's a recent immigrant, so that we can know to get them out if there's a flash flood warning. That comes from the bottom up, and it's a distributed capacity. So the more I can do to maximize that, the less I need to do. What I see now is waste. Stories like this are not going to change this dynamic. It's expanding community capacity to communicate and be influential.
Yeah, I completely agree with both those things. And I think the story of how we get to that point, to genuine community self-determination over climate responses from here, was kind of top-down, COP-driven climate conversation, is a story of energy democracy, which lots of people have been talking about, right? But community level genuine control over energy would just be one element of things, but an important one, obviously. And I think tied up with that is conversation 10, 15 years from now that's dominated not by individuals who kind of symbolically represent marginalized populations, but actual organizations that are built for the defense of those populations. And historically, we've had a good example of at least one kind of organization that can do that, and that's, of course, unions. Right? Those are organized groups of people that fight for workers, and at their best, that fight for the communities that workers are part of. And I think that's the direction globally that I'd love to see climate politics go 10 to 15 years from now. And it's fraught for all sorts of reasons. I'm sure we can talk about them, but that's where I think it has to go.
Thank you all. What do you think are the challenges right now in representing climate, as you've all described it, that we should be seeing in 10, 15 years? What do you think the challenges are to getting there right now in the media and in the arts?
Oh my God. I can't wait.
Maybe I'll just go first, just because it's more or less a continuation of the point that I just made. But yeah, I think we have kind of moral and political habits that aren't built for the kind of crisis that climate crisis is. You know, we have a way of engaging with politics that, especially in the U.S., but not solely in the U.S., right? But a way of engaging with politics and a way of describing at the media level that is very kind of personality heavy. And that doesn't connect in any systematic way, perhaps in no way at all, with the broader dynamics that we're trying to challenge by way of electing this or that person or supporting this or that high level legislation. And so I think our ways of talking about the climate crisis, our ways of representing it in the media have tended to take on some of those characteristics. So we have one set of people who are spokespeople for a generation or a group of people. Maybe it was Greta for a while, and then the way of challenging that is, should it be this other person, and so on and so forth. But that whole framework needs to go, I think. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I think part of the reason why I wanted to prioritize everyday people's stories and not just the voices of politicians or climate scientists is because I think that the way that we discuss climate change can feel really abstract and inaccessible to a lot of people. If we talk about degrees of temperature change or feet of sea level rise or parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it can be difficult to understand what that means and what that feels like. And the way that I see of breaking that down and how I think we can do a better job just collectively in like arts, the media, anywhere in everyday conversations of bringing up these topics in a way that brings like evokes more feeling, and feeling can evoke action, right? Is by relying on storytelling. It's an ancient technology. Humans are storytelling creatures, right? And so if I tell you the story of mother of 3 in Tuvalu, which is a low-lying coral atoll nation in the South Pacific, who during an intense drought a couple years ago had to make really difficult decisions about how to allocate water within her family, right? That becomes a stickier story than just talking about how a certain small change in sea level around that island has impacted the groundwater and drinking water supply and made it salty. So I think that storytelling can be an answer. And the other thing I just wanted to add is that of the few people I spoke with in this 5-year trip who we might classify as really far on the side of climate deniers, what they told me is that they didn't trust the science. I think that comes down to a lack of science education or a failure in that system, but also that they were seeing these same images over and over again that just felt really abstract to them, frankly. And those were, maybe a polar bear or a video of a calving piece of ice on a glacier. And for them, the repetition of those images was suspicious. And that's, a failure, I think, of the science communication. We have to find better metaphors, better ways of talking about these issues that bring people in, that create a shared sense of values and then move forward from there. But that kind of climate storytelling that is frankly just more creative that will better serve everyone in the long run.
Yeah. The framing, the thing that I missed for too long, I mean, literally, I've been at this for 33 years, almost half of my entire life, is focusing so much on global warming, meaning the global pattern, as opposed to focusing on climate risk. You see, climate change, that warming and what it's doing to weather patterns and sea level, is one driver of risk. that any community faces. And it's not the only driver. We're also building stupidly. Much of California's problem these days is that we're building communities into forests that were where fire was suppressed for 100 years. That's a really bad idea. And you're increasing climate risk in ways that no community wants to be at risk, whether you're libertarian or liberal. You don't want to be doing that. So the more we take this to this idea that we're in the foreground, you're talking about climate risk and climate opportunity, as opposed to, you need to believe in climate change, the better off we'll be. Now, I don't know if we can share screen. You would have to initiate it, but this is just one simple visual I use sometimes. If you could share it, if not, no problem. I put it in the queue. At any rate, it just changes the whole dynamic to start with that. Who's at risk in our community? As I said earlier, it's the elderly person in the tenement living on the upper floors that don't have air conditioning. Yeah, this is one simple thing. It's pavement exacerbates flooding. Pervious surface. We need a better word for that. The opposite of waterproof. Spongy. Sponge cities. That's what China is trying to pursue. That's an opportunity. And the same thing is for energy. But, while you got that open, I'll just show you. I was in India, in Faltan, India, which is a town east of Mumbai. And this is people. This is energy risk. These are people using biomass to heat their bath water and cook their food in the morning. And wouldn't it be great if that was electric induction, or actually even LPG, even propane, which is really clean burning fuel? So the idea there too is you're saying that's energy risk. And we're surrounded by those opportunities and possibilities. And I just think that's a way to go that can change a lot of this rhetoric and create common actions. Again, you get around all those roadblocks with it's become a cultural divider, just like abortion and gun rights, and race. Sadly, we're just surrounded by these issues that become flashpoints for conversation. And when you get down to the humanity part of it, suddenly people can start to convene and address problems.
Thank you all. I'd like to take 1 second to just invite everybody who is watching online to submit any questions that you might have for our panelists into the chat, and we will get to them in just a little while. So given everything that you all just mentioned about the huge disconnect between where we are today and where we would need to be to make sure that we're hearing from everybody who's impacted, that we're seeing what's happening in real people's lives and not just at the distant polls where most people are never going to really set foot. What do you see as an opportunity for the media and in the arts to begin to connect where we are today to where we dream of being in a few years? What would be those first steps that you think could happen? I think Femi did a really great job of explaining where we are today with regards to what the media is focusing on and where we could be in bringing more people into that conversation and hearing from more people who are directly impacted. So what do you think are those first steps that media or artists could take today to begin that journey?
Yeah, I could offer a couple of thoughts. I think it's happening to a certain extent, at least not in the mainstream media. They're still gatekeepers, unfortunately. I worked at one of them for 20 years, the New York Times. I wrote, when I created my blog there, which is an interactive form of journalism, it wasn't because someone said, hey, Andy, we need a blog on sustainability and climate. It was because I saw a really big gap. And I also saw the opportunity when I just started to realize you can have a conversation with communities. But that's still gatekeeping, right? I'm moderating 100,000 comments through 2,800 pieces over 9 years. It's the turning that over to communities is a new step. At Columbia, this webcast I've been doing, the Sustain What thing, I have a what I call friendly takeover policy. So I literally turn over, it's on StreamYard, the same thing we're using here. But I've had students, there was a group of students working on a new economics for the Anthropocene, economics that's equitable, that supports a care economy. And they ran 2 sessions, and they were at universities across North America. They weren't, me. I literally disappeared from the screen. So we can do it. And then there's a wonderful organization, If Not Us, Then Who.me, which is indigenous communities across the Amazon and elsewhere who are being facilitated and telling their own stories. The more we can do to flip that so that, take these capacities we all have, whether it's Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, or the homepage of an institution like the Times or Columbia, to kind of turn over the controls is one thing we can do. It's not enough on its own, but it's certainly one thing. Just one brief thing on artists. There are great artists working in this arena. Stacey Levy, who's based in Pennsylvania, she makes, there's a role for all kind of art that's provocative, that nudges you, but her art is actually active. She does these pieces. They're like floating grasslands that she puts into lakes that have been eutrophied through too much nutrients. And so that the sculpture is actually sucking nutrients out of the lake. So it's a piece of art that's actively remediating the environment. It just shows you the sort of the range of things that are out there.
I'll just say a quick thing. I think just following up on what Devi was saying before, the power of storytelling. One of the things that I think is most promising are the kind of larger scale stories that folks are starting to tell that require, really difficult collaborative work, often across lots of different kinds of journalists and journalistic institutions. But I think there's a lot of value in that kind of approach, combining, storytelling, which is naturally powerful, with the kind of scale that really fits the climate crisis. So the Pandora Papers, actually, that investigation strikes me as the kind of collaboration that is really promising, not just because it exposes the global kleptocratic elite that we have, but also just because the kind of collaboration that involved really it was kind of distributed scale, right? There's the high level story, hey, they're stealing all the wealth. But at different levels of, different countries focused on the things that were relevant there. Premium Times Nigeria had a set of pieces around what the Pandora Papers uncovered in Nigeria. There were a bunch of stories in Kenya about what the high-level investigation told them about the Kenyatas and so on and so forth, right? And I think that kind of distributed scale lets us solve a lot of the problems of, at a certain point, exactly like Debbie said earlier, right? All this stuff becomes abstract and ethereal if there's only the high level, here's how much money is in the tax havens. You might as well say Google Jillion, it doesn't mean anything at a personal level, but drilling down into scales where it does mean things for people, where it involves people that they know, where it involves structures that they tangibly interact with. I think that's a promising approach.
Yeah, definitely. I think just to build on what Olu said, there's more room that I see for kind of hyper local climate storytelling that's breaking down, again, these bigger ideas and bringing it to the level of maybe one group of people in one individual community. One of the stories that comes most readily to mind from the research that I did for the book was of this woman named Tanea Tangaroa, who's based in Wanganui, New Zealand. And she saw a problem in her community where there was a wetland that had been used as a dump for several generations. And the water was completely toxic in that area, and it was a haven for invasive species of plants and animals, and kind of this place that no one went anymore, even though it had been capped and filled. And the landfill itself was unlined because of when it was created, so there's still that problem of leachate coming out. But she spent something like 2 decades doing the really hard everyday work of hauling out those invasive plants and spending time to heal the landscape, kind of live both physically and spiritually, and now uses it as a site of environmental education for kids in her community to come in and understand about these invasive species, but also the native species that were there in the first place. And that kind of slow everyday work, I mean, it's not flashy, it's not overnight. I think we want a lot of these solutions to be immediate, right? But emphasizing that there are people who are doing really incredible things in their communities right now, and that it's a slow, intimate process, deeply enmeshed with the landscape, that places that people call home, right? Those kind of stories are the things that give me hope, right? And that it's hope is a verb and it's an active thing, but I see just more room for that kind of storytelling to broaden the conversation, both in the media, arts, and everywhere, frankly.
So you all have touched on, the importance of storytelling in order to reach people's hearts and to bring more people's stories to light. But then there's this disconnect with our long-term approach being focused on the regulatory side of things. And then Femi, you mentioned the need that we really need to get to a place where we have genuine community-driven solutions to climate. And so given those three things, our historical approach to regulations and maybe society's thinking that that's the solution, that we really need that element in order to push us forward, especially given what scientists are telling us is this very short timeline that we have in order to get someplace. So I think in a lot of people's minds, there's a disconnect where people definitely agree that, Devi, like the example you just gave, we need more of that. We need to hear more about it. It gives us a lot of hope, but it's, almost a drop in a bucket, right, of all of the things that we need. So what do you all see as sort of the way that we can move from telling these small scale stories to the scale of action that is needed on the time frame that scientists are telling us that we have to make that leap? Do you have any thoughts on how we can get there? No small question, really.
Well, scale is the word that I always apply to anyone who has a bright new idea, whether it's a new battery design or communication method. In fact, I'm planning to do a series of pieces on my revkin.bulletin.com platform at scale. So I think that's a frontier. I don't think we know yet. And that leads to the one thing I've seen a couple of examples of that go in the other direction is funding. Funders need to think about flipping their expectations for what they put resources into when they think about climate action. $1 billion was spent to push climate legislation by nonprofit philanthropy in the last 10, 12, 15 years. It was the 2009 bill which fell apart, and more recently. And hardly any of that went into communication. Or if it did, the parts that went into communication were conventional. They were not what we're talking about here. The Moore Foundation did something really cool recently that I got to learn because it was through a group at Columbia. Scientists in Columbia were given a grant with a community in the Arctic, the Inupiat community in Kotzebue in the Arctic part of Alaska. And the grant was to build a relationship between the scientists and the community so the scientists could apply their climate understanding to solving community problems. And it was not like an outcome-driven grant. It wasn't like, here's $1 million, come out with a report, 2 years, publish several papers. And together, they've now published papers. The community are authors on these papers with the scientists on sea ice variability as it relates to hazards for traditional the hunters who go out on the ice and stuff like that. And if we do enough of that on the sort of vulnerability side, I think we're going to be in much better shape going forward than we are right now. Whether it's flood, fire, sea ice variability, people falling through snowmobiles. On the energy side, I'd love to find out more about that idea of energy democracy. that we were just talking about. I think here's where the upside of social media can actually matter. There's an organization in Canada. It's myheat.ca. I encourage people to click there. It's sort of a Google Maps showing two things: who's got solar panels and who your house, how much heat your house is leaking from wasted energy. And it can create a sort of a tidal swell of community interest. And oh wow, I can save money by tightening my house, and poorer communities in my neighborhood, they can't afford to do that. What can you do to help them? That kind of thing. So it's going to take time. This is a tough challenge. Decarbonization, changing our relationship with energy after 200 years of carbonization is not going to happen as quickly as we like. So that, by the way, that just flips back to the importance of working on vulnerability reduction, risk reduction now as well.
I think when I think about scale, I think about the pressure that it is so easy to feel to take on the whole of the problem as an individual, and that if only I can, minimize my waste and live the absolutely most carbon neutral lifestyle possible, will this problem be solved? And I think that is really a fast track to despair, frankly. Yes, it's important to think about our individual contributions, but in fact, the idea of a carbon footprint, I think was a PR stunt by the fossil fuel industry in the first place, right? And so, it's a distraction. Of course, we want to be doing our best individually, but what we really need to do is be targeting the fossil fuel industry and perhaps that infrastructure directly, because big infrastructure projects will bake in emissions for generations. And so there's, some really incredible people on the ground who are targeting pieces of infrastructure like Line 3 or coal-fired power plants in New Hampshire. There's countless examples. And I think that in order to think about scale or just really act in a way that's scaled up, the best thing we can do is not focus so much on our individual contributions, but instead get together with other people who are targeting these bigger systemic problems that stem from the fossil fuel industry directly, and going in that way in a kind of collective, concerted, organized manner.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Devi and Andy said. I guess I'll just add one thing, which is that scale is a result. It's an outcome. It's a feature of system behavior. And I think we should be less, I think we have to think about scale, but it's not as though getting results at scale is something that's just going to happen just because we thought of it. And it's also not something that's only the kind of target that you can hit when you're expressly aiming at it. I think we should try to do the best things that we can in our circumstances and understand that one possible result is good things happening from that at scale. In 1517, Martin Luther sent a letter, which was basically a listicle, to one guy. Like, here's 95 reasons that maybe the church should stop selling indulgences. Maybe that's a bad idea, right? And that was the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, right? It was a huge, globally shaping thing that happened because, or happened after, I should say, one person sent one letter. Martin Luther didn't create the problems with the church or the widespread dissent that was kind of set off by the 95 Theses. But nevertheless, his writings played a role in setting up this huge chain of social reactions. And I think that's how social systems work. We don't know what thing it can potentially set off large-scale social change. So the best that we can do is keep in mind what we're trying to achieve on a big scale while we do the things at the small scale that we can actually do.
Yeah, that's such a cool story. That reminds me of something the Pope said in 2016 in his encyclical. There was a section in there on social media. It was buried among all the climate stuff. I wrote about it on my blog at the time, saying, because I was so excited. He was saying the social media of our time can be a force for good or ill. Go with the upside. And he was driving, he says there's a moral imperative to not abandon this, what seems like a morass right now, to forces who would disinform or paralyze and get busy. So I guess that builds on Martin Luther's example of being communicative.
Andy, bringing up social media, obviously, it's a place where so many people, get all of their information about so many different topics. Do you see it playing, or its potentially, I guess, to play an important role in sharing these stories? And then, its counterpart. How do you, see that playing out with the addition of disinformation that people are seeing in those platforms?
It scares me more than the climate crisis. The information crisis right now is when especially when you layer that on like American politics, how factions can paralyze here. I wouldn't say I'm not hopeful, but this is a real tough challenge. The column that I write now is for a website that was launched by Facebook this summer. Malala is on it. Other really neat people are on it. I had to think about it. That was before the latest revelations on Facebook too. I still feel that there's a way to work within that to build some sense of rational information flows and engagement and inclusion. They put $5 million into supporting regional journalists in underserved and Black communities. That's a tiny down payment on what's needed. So the ultimate gatekeepers right now are the algorithms at Facebook and Twitter. And you go on Twitter, and if you're doing anything about climate, you watch for the Exxon pop-up greenwash. It just comes boop, 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 right? It's all around you. So there's a huge amount of work to be done. But if we don't engage, if we pull back, if we turn off, I like a lot of Jaron Lanier's writing. He's one of the early internet pioneers. He wrote this book, 10 Reasons to Turn Off Your Stuff. And I'm like, no, know how poison it is, know how toxified it is, but don't turn it off. Get in there and work on it.
There are a couple things I want to say. The first one is, I think this is something that philosophers of science and epistemologists, I mention them because they're my colleagues, something they have thought about in really structural ways that I think are helpful, right? It's whole social knowledge producing institutions and what trust networks there are between those institutions and people. And those are the kinds of things being upset by problems with social media, but it's that level of scale that is worth thinking about in terms of rebuilding, right? So whether it's public option or public regulation of some of these algorithms, which are designed to maximize ad revenue and engagement via clicks rather than, all the public goods that are at stake, or whether it's some other kind of publicly minded approach, maybe antitrust legislation, but something at scale I think would be helpful. And in the meantime, one thing that I think about is the various kinds of knowledge producing institutions, and actually from a social perspective, how cheap it would be to get them to work better. right? If fewer people were kept in adjunct precarity who are academics, if more journalists had a basic income so that they could follow the actual stories, and follow stories at scale rather than having to work on things at a pace dictated to by their landlord, you know, rather than by what it actually requires to do good journalism, which many people know how to do, right? I think if you had basic forms of economic security for the kinds of people who are producing the information that we need, then we would be likelier to have quality information that people would be more inclined to respect. That's not the only thing that you have to do. Obviously, there's deep cultural divides. The hollowing out of local journalism is part and parcel of those divides because it removes, people who have real organic social relationships to the town around them and replaces them with, Alex Jones. It's not surprising that you get QAnon after that, right? But it's one of the economic security for knowledge producers is one of the things that would be helpful, I think.
You're here.
Devi, would you like to add anything?
I don't know. I think these platforms are a tool like anything else, and it's easy for them to be manipulated for ill intent. And thinking about them in a global context, one of the main things that we learned from the Facebook papers recently is that the vast majority of the funding for content moderation and figuring out where these problems are is going to the US. So what we're getting here is the best possible version of Facebook and Instagram. And that's not to say anything of the, vast amounts of really problematic mis and disinformation that is happening in places like Ethiopia or just in languages where the content moderation doesn't exist or isn't strong enough. And so I think that we have a lot to do societally to push these platforms to be better. And that, it's interconnected with the climate work in some interesting ways, just in terms of how information comes to people. And I think that we can probably all do a better job of diversifying the sources of information that come into our lives. But doing that within the current information environment can be really challenging.
Thank you all. I'm going to turn to a couple of questions that we've gotten in the chat. The first one is, they all kind of turn towards looking at some of these solutions and how do we move past the challenges that we're at now. The first question is for Andy. Could you tell us more about the hopes for the Columbia Climate School?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the idea of the climate school, there was an Earth Institute here for 25 years. That's where I got hired 2 years ago to build this communication initiative. It's becoming a subset of this climate school. The idea is to have a school that does all the things that campuses are really bad at, crosses the disciplines and practices, so that the law school and the engineering school, philosophy, humanities, communication, not that we don't have a communication department, woefully, are able to convene and look at the climate problem list and the communities at risk and come up with actionable plans and scholarship to action. That's a heavy lift, right? Because especially anyone out there in academia knows that that talks about things that just are really hard to do. So that's the plan. And I'm part of what I do, along with my external stuff, these webcasts and my blog and stuff, is to facilitate the internal communication landscape so that an artist, can meet a climate scientist who just got back from the Arctic with new data and wants to turn it into some kind of visualization, so that the School of Social Work is involved. Courtney Coburn, who's a fantastic scholar and practitioner here, working on visualizing using like VR for people to understand how race affects health outcomes. She's been actively engaging with the climate school too, and so the more of that, the better. That's the goal.
Thank you. Now, broadening it to everyone and this question as a director of sustainability at a university. I'm very curious what your answers are, but what does climate change demand of our universities sort of collectively?
I'll let the other go. I kind of answered that question, so.
Yeah, as someone who's also at a university, I've been thinking about this. I mean, I think it intensifies some things that were already true about the university, particularly as universities grow as, investment vehicles and as city shaping entities. I think one of the things that's required by the university with climate crisis is to try to forge a different relationship to the surrounding area than that we've currently forged. One of the things that struck me about the Flint water crisis is that the labs that tested the water were not the ones nearby, right? And that's not an attempt to drag Michigan academic institutions in particular, but that's just, well, maybe it should be now that I think about it, but it's not like there's some failing that they're making that other universities aren't making, right? I got my PhD the same way all of my colleagues did. I just kind of figured out what I wanted to work on, and then I convinced 4 people who already had PhDs that it was cool, and then they gave me a degree, right? There was no point in that process which was meaningfully responsive to what the surrounding community of Los Angeles needed to know, right? It was all just a kind of reward for having done sufficiently well on the GRE that now I get to read books that I think are cool. And I don't think that needs to be what a university is, right? And elsewhere in the world, that isn't what a university is, right? Universities are deeply involved in the political and cultural ecology of the places that they are literally physically housed in. And I think that, if nothing else, is what universities are called for to do by the climate crisis. Like, if you are in a city as a university, other than buying up all the real estate and serving as a major employer, underpaying the people who live in that city, like what is another relationship that we can have to the world that we're immediately housed in? And once we're there, I think a lot of the other stuff in terms of how universities can produce things that are climate relevant, can produce climate relevant knowledge, can itself participate in climate relevant investment and movement of capital. I think all that stuff will fall into place naturally, or I hope it will.
Yeah, those are both really good points. I think, I'm not at a university right now, but I have been to one. I think for me, universities at their best are places where conversations and collaborations can happen that might not be possible anywhere else, just because people are physically together in the same space and dedicating so much time and energy to thought and the production of ideas. And so the 2 things that seem important to emphasize, or maybe 3 things. The first would be interdisciplinary collaboration and just finding ways to let students kind of trust them with their own vision of what they want to learn and let them pick and choose across different departments to create something that feels cohesive and is in service of their future goals. The second thing is that I think climate change should be a part of every course, right? There's a climate change way that we can look at 18th century literature, right? There's climate change that needs to be a part of art classes or maybe dance and movement, right? There's lots of different ways to be thinking about and accessing these issues and making them more accessible to students and to the surrounding community. And I think that kind of broadening the way that individual syllabi are thought about is one great way of doing that. And then thirdly, I don't know, I think about friends of mine who learned about climate change, not in the classroom, but by getting involved with the divestment campaign on Harvard's campus, or by leaning really into other types of activism that was happening locally in the Boston area. And I think that that is a really valuable thing to do, and is something that students should figure out the causes that they care about and go after that. And I think that that's a really valuable function of universities in creating better citizens, frankly.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm so glad you mentioned the idea that climate change should be included in every class. I frequently champion the idea that every job should be a green job, regardless of what field you're going into. You should have the skills when you leave a university to know how what you're doing connects to the environment, and then be empowered to start to shift it in a positive direction. Again, I'd like to invite everybody who's watching online to share any questions you might have in the chat, and we'll be happy to get to them. The next one we have, focused on solutions again, is there some type of cheat sheet in existence that might easily outline the types of things that we could do as individuals or in our personal lives to help mitigate climate change?
I replied in a comment on YouTube. That's kind of what I'm trying to build a little bit at this Sustain What bulletin thing I'm doing. But it's rather than a single cheat sheet, I think what is already there, especially on Twitter, for all of its nightmarish qualities, there's an extraordinary amount of expertise on Twitter on both climate vulnerability, adaptation, on the ethics, on activism. And you can, if you actively engage with keywords, you can really find answers to almost any question pretty quickly. I've done this, I have a significant reach, so that, but I don't think it's just that. I live in an old house, and I was trying to figure out whether we're still dependent on oil heat here in the Hudson Valley, where I live in this part of Lenape territory. And I keep trying to figure out. So I've connected with people who specialize in old house conversions. It's all there. So it's really an internal mindset more than some resource. And then you can spread that wisdom yourself, within your community by building a network too. I'd like to think there's a single go-to place, but that's really, it's an internal capacity you can build. Unless someone knows of one. Does either of you know of one?
I don't know of one. I think building one, building localized or regionalized cheat sheets would be, and then updating them regularly would be an excellent project for someone to take up. I think it would be super useful. Just because, the thing that it occurred to me to say is, there's a lot of things that are, wherever you are, I think fighting for public power, if you don't already have it, is a great idea. Wherever you are, I think divestment from fossil fuels into something that won't destroy the planet is a great idea. But there's a lot more specific things that we're thinking about depending on where you are, right? The possibilities of city politics are probably different in Boston, where they just elected Michelle Wu, who ran on a Green New Deal agenda, than they are in Birmingham, let's say. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of local stuff in the political sense, and then there's also local stuff in the literal kind of ecological sense, right? What species are native to where you are? Can you help sequester carbon and increase food security for a community by planting local fruit trees, right? If so, which trees, right? Like those kinds of questions, require specific locations and specific earth science knowledge. And I think collaborating, collaborating to build that kind of guidance would be an awesome project.
Yeah, I think it's like, the advice is like to write the book you want to read, like create the cheat sheet that you want to see. Probably the best way to do that is to go to the people who have the knowledge and in your area. But I love that idea. I think it's really important.
Just circling back to that last question about academia, we can help with that, right? Theoretically,
Yeah, absolutely.
Just the infrastructure, not just the infrastructure, but internet access. So there's a place for local communities who maybe they don't have their own Wi-Fi, they can come on by and unlock some of that capacity we have.
Building off of that, I'm just curious, if you were starting to write that cheat sheet, what would you put as the top item for people to look at in their communities? Maybe not a specific action, but that first thing that you think somebody should start to look at, to figure out what the first action should be on their community specific cheat sheet.
For me, it's just what I said at the very beginning: climate risk. Start with the word risk, and who's at risk? Why are they at risk? What are the factors that shape that risk? What are the processes or actions or investments that can reduce that risk? That's it. And when you do that, the thing that's called climate justice now, you really is a subset or a big chunk of what we think, what you see when you start to map climate risk. And energy risk too, like who's living near the power plant, so it works for energy and climate too. Sorry.
I mean, not to over intellectualize everything, but maybe the first thing on my list would be to take a look around at what's already happening, right? And just like Debbie reminded us just a second ago, right? Like people have this knowledge, and it's not necessary to reinvent the wheel, and in fact, they can muddy the waters to reinvent the wheel. So, action is good, but if you're committed to being effective, it's helpful to just be like, what is the state of local climate politics here? What do the people who've been doing this for 10 years think we should be doing? And what is the state of play? Are our utilities investor owned or are they publicly owned? What's our water situation like? And who knows, right? Who has been working on those issues, and who can I ask to get started?
I'm just going to talk again about fossil fuel infrastructure because I think it's one of the most impactful ways that groups of people are taking steps towards creating a better climate future. And so plugging into that kind of activism where it's already happening in your area, I think is a great place to start.
Great, thank you all. So we've talked a lot about, at the very beginning, we talked a lot about who's setting the climate agenda, who are we seeing right now, and where would we like to see that be in a few years for setting the agenda. But how do you think that we can move from really recognizing climate change in our communities and understanding how it's impacting us? How can we move from seeing climate change into acting on it?
That's where the rubber hits the road, right? I guess that's where assessment comes in, tracking things. And I think the world is better now, way better than it was when I started on this beat, certainly in the 80s, 90s, and even in the 2000s, because of observation capacity. There's, Environmental Defense Fund, a private environmental nonprofit, is launching its own satellite to track methane, who's cheating on methane. There's a nonprofit that uses satellite data to track which coal-fired power plants are active and inactive in China. And there's infrared cameras that can show you pollution levels in your own community of methane emissions or other kinds of gases that are leaking from factories or gas compressors or whatever, and you can measure change, right? You can measure if it's getting worse or better, and you take that to the political sphere and you say, then I think you can start to see, you can at least test whether change is possible. So I think we're in a much better place than we were 10 or 20 years ago. And what you heard a minute ago from Olufemi about, well, first it was the Panama Papers, and now this the new batch of papers. That fostering that capacity for local, as he said, for local journalism to just be on the case, even as conventional newsrooms are being emptied out, is a primal part of this. You've got to have that feedback, testing, transparency.
I'll just say something quickly. I totally agree that having the knowledge about who's polluting is good and important. But on the other side of that, that knowledge needs to present some kind of consequence that shareholders understand and care about, right? And I think it's that side of things that we've failed to come up with answers for, at least up until the present day. It's that kind of political situation defined by regulatory capture and all these other sorts of elite capture. That's the reason why, people on the climate left, like Andreas Malm, who's, his last book was literally called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Like, that's the stage that we're at, right? Where there's been a total intransigence from the political and economic elite to translating all this wealth of information that we've had for decades about why they shouldn't be doing the things that they're doing into an actual plan to stop doing the things that they're doing, right?
Yeah.
So for me, it comes back to unions, right? Not because unions are magic, not because everybody who's in a union is a Mother Teresa or something, but because unions communicate to capital in a language that it understands, right? You keep messing up, no work for you, which means less money for you, right? I don't have to convince you that the earth is important. I don't have to convince you that you should be meaningfully a good answer. I don't have to convince you that it matters that this community is being poisoned or harmed by your actions. I need to convince you that if you don't do otherwise, you lose on your terms. And that is the power that unions have, and there's no substitute for it as far as I can tell. Right? There's no substitute for that kind of political power. And so I think, as I said before, I'm encouraged by FUP, the union of Petrobras workers calling for opposing privatization, calling for a clean energy transition to Brazil's fossil fuel company. I'm encouraged by, in South Africa, the South African Federation of Trade Unions and the Climate Justice Coalition that they're a part of, calling for a green new ESCOM. So moving to just transition in a renewable direction there as well. I think those are the kinds of things that, that's the kind of momentum, that's the train we need to get on globally. That's the lead we need to follow, I think.
Yeah. That book by Andreas Malm was a fascinating read. And I wrote an essay for Vice that was kind of running some of his ideas about nonviolent direct action and the limits of nonviolence by folks who are on the front lines of protesting at Line 3. And they had some really interesting responses, because not everyone is in a place or a position in terms of their, identity or existing privilege where they're able to take that kind of risk of legal action. So anyway, tangent, but great book. Highly recommend it. It's a good conversation starter. How to blow up a pipeline. But I think that in terms of translating, seeing climate change into acting on it, the one thing that I keep coming back to is just knowing yourself really well internally, taking a stock of what your strengths are and what that intersection place where, you wake up really excited to take action on these issues. And climate change itself is a huge problem. It's not that you're going to be able to take that all on, but breaking it down into its component parts and to, where you are located at, what people are already working on, what you're excited about doing, and then what strengths unique to you that you have that you can add to that effort, I think is a good place to start.
Thank you all so much. We just have one more minute, so I just want to go around really quickly, maybe less than 5-word answer. But as people think about all of this and the future and where we need to head and how we need to bring more people's stories to the forefront and listen to them, where do you, Devi mentioned earlier that it's so easy in some of this to fall into a circle of despair. And so where do you all look for hope? Where could people who are watching today, where would you recommend that they look to kind of keep that hope alive as we move forward on this really, really big task?
I guess the one, if not us, then who? If all one word, if not us, then who.me is the Indigenous network. Think about that, look at it, and then think about it in wider contexts.
History. Cataclysmic changes to the political structure of the world have happened in the last 2 centuries, and much as the powers that be try to ignore the Haitian Revolution or the massive decolonization of the post-Second World War period, these were huge defining things that happened through world history. We can change the world at scale because we've done it already, and we just need to do it again in this particular way.
Yeah, those are both great. I would just say that hope is a verb and it comes from doing something. So find people who are doing stuff and then join up with them, because it's easy to feel that kind of hope when you're in community.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all again so much for joining us this morning. And again, the link is in the chat, so you can learn more about the other events that are coming today and tomorrow. Thank you all.
Wow.